Welcome to our study on the Gospel of Matthew. Today we are considering Jesus' teachings on the values and choices of a true disciple of Christ. Matthew 5-7 comprises the Great Sermon on the Mount. Jesus gathers a group of disciples on the mountaintop, separating them from the desperate but selfish seekers at the bottom of the hill, who want healing more than transformation. In this, the first discipleship training, Jesus tells these would-be disciples how they can be part of the solution to the problems the people clamoring around them have. To be the solution, his disciples need to possess the right attitudes discussed in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus wants his disciples to practice the spiritual disciplines of giving, prayer, and fasting with a vertical focus on God, not a horizontal focus on being seen and honored by men. They should practice these disciplines in the sight of God and not in order to impress people. In today's lesson, we find out how Jesus concludes his great sermon. Before we go to Matthew chapter 7, let's ponder the last part of Matthew chapter 6, which is a wonderful study in values. Jesus explains that the values of God are best seen in our lives when we follow the command in Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. When you prioritize God's kingdom and his righteousness in our lives, then not only are our values right, but our needs are also met providentially in God's time. Jesus helps us to discern whether we truly possess the values of God. If you want to know what your values are, he says, consider these questions. How is your attitude? How do you think? What are your anxieties? What do you worry about? What are your activities? What do you do most of the time? What are your ambitions? What are you striving for? What are your allegiances? Whom do you end up serving at the end of the day? Finally, what matters most to you in this life? This should be your number one value. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. When you begin to value what God values, then and only then are you right with God. Now let's begin our study in Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew 7:1-5, Jesus says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus brings the first discipleship training event to a close. Jesus is saying here, make the commitment to look in. Look in means dealing with your own life. Jesus had started his sermon this way, teaching the Beatitudes, and he concludes this way, calling us to be wary of our judgmental attitudes toward others. Jesus teaches his disciples that they should first look at their own attitudes and actions before judging others. To illustrate his point, Jesus asks, why are you going around through life with the conviction that your mission in life is to find the speck of dust in other people's eyes when you have a log jammed in your own eye? It is a ridiculous image. Someone closely inspecting others' eyes to find specks while they have an entire log stuck in their own eye. This picture shows that Jesus has a great sense of humor. There really are people who fit this hilarious metaphor. They're always picking others apart over minor things, while they are a mess. Jesus asks these people two questions. First, he asks, why are you so hypercritical? And second, he asks, how can you hope to be effective helping others when your own problems are so significant? The next words from Jesus don't show any humor. He says, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. When it comes to relational problems, a disciple of Christ always looks in at himself first. We must first let God deal with our lives before we can help others. Now, to be clear, in this passage, Jesus is not saying we should never judge, nor that we must be perfect before we can make judgments. This passage begins with judge not, and many people like to just stop there. People who are being confronted with their own sin often say, the Bible says, judge not. They should, however, read the whole passage in Matthew 7:1-5. Jesus does say, judge not, But he goes on to clarify, judge yourself first and get that log out of your eye. Solve your own problem, and then you will see clearly to judge others and to help them with their problems. The problem is not judgment, rather being judgmental. We need judgments that are accurate, done in the right spirit, and having the right end goals. Will you make the commitment to look in at yourself? Will you make every effort by God's grace to get the log out of your own eye before you become obsessed with the speck of dust in your brother's eye? Moving on, in Matthew 7:7-11, Jesus says, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him?" Jesus tells his would-be disciples, make the commitment to look up to God. We were challenged to look in at ourselves, and now Jesus is challenging us to look up to God, and to do so with perseverance. Jesus is challenging his disciples to ask continuously, seek diligently, and knock ceaselessly, as they await the answers for their prayers. As the disciples practice this, Jesus assures them that everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, everyone who knocks eventually finds himself standing before an open door. Jesus says to his disciples, "You will never be part of my solution until you make the commitment to look up, to consistently look up to God and seek his grace and mercy." In Matthew 7:12, we hear Jesus reaching for a verdict in a third direction. Jesus says, "Now make the commitment to look around." This is where Jesus gives us his greatest ethical teaching. That teaching is simply this: in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets. We call this the Golden Rule. If we really lived out this profound principle, it would solve almost all of our relational problems. Now, you cannot simply say, what would you want someone to do if you were in their position? Criminals would want to be let off without punishment. Teenagers would want no rules or limits. Strangers would want you to give them all your stuff. The homeless would want you to support them for life without asking them to change their ways. What the Golden Rule does mean is that one should express the same kind of loving concern for others that they show for themselves and wish that others would show them. People, however foolish about it at times, seek their own good. People worry about themselves. They spend significant amounts of time seeking out their own best interest. The Golden Rule says that mental and physical energy that you give to seeking your own good, do that for the people around you too. Now let's examine how Jesus calls the hearers of the sermon to respond to the teaching. After teaching this, Jesus calls for a response from his listeners. Jesus is expecting that his listeners make a commitment to look around. Jesus began the first discipleship training event by issuing a challenge. Where are you? Are you part of the problem, like the ones at the bottom of the mountain? Or are you part of the solution up here on the mountaintop with me? Now, when you get to the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, you hear a similar challenge. Where are you? This time, however, it's different. This time, Jesus is saying, where are you as a disciple? What kind of a disciple are you? In 3 beautiful statements, Jesus brings his teaching to a final challenge. First, Jesus challenges his disciples by saying, there are 2 kinds of disciples, the many and the few. The many think the Christian life is an easy path, accessed by a wide gate. The few know that being salt and light requires a disciplined and difficult path, accessed by the narrow gate. Which one are you? Second, Jesus says, there are the false disciples and there are the true disciples. There are wolves in sheep's clothing who look like they are part of the flock, and there are tares in the field of wheat that look like healthy plants. Therefore, Jesus issues this challenge to his disciples. Beware and examine yourself. Which are you? Finally, Jesus says, there are those who simply say they are disciples, and then there are those who truly live as disciples. Jesus says in Matthew 7:22-23, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Do you just talk about being a disciple of Christ? Or do you live like one on a daily basis? That is the challenge to us. Jesus concludes his teaching on the mountaintop with this great illustration. We can summarize what Jesus says in Matthew 7:24-27 as follows. This is life. Two houses standing side by side, storms pounding down on both. One is collapsing under the storm, the other is not. Now, what is Jesus illustrating here? Jesus says, if you hear my teaching and obey it, you are like that house that is not collapsing because its foundation is secure in the rock. If, however, you hear my teaching and do not obey it, you are like that house built on the sand that has no foundation, and therefore it collapses because of the storms. One last time, Jesus challenges his disciples with the question, which kind of disciple will you be? As you study the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, ask yourself, have I really made the commitment to look in and get that log out of my eye? Have I made the commitment to look up and ask and seek and knock until I break through to God? Have I really made the commitment to look around and treat others the way I would like to be treated? Am I one of the many, or am I one of the few? Am I one of the false or the true? Am I one of those who just claim to be a disciple, or am I the one who daily seeks to do the will of God through Jesus Christ? Examine yourselves along these lines. Fervently seek the Lord's grace to live as a disciple of Christ who brings Jesus' solutions to the world's problems. Be the salt and light in a desperately needy world.